Welcome to Biblios, the space where we think about biblical thinking. We've been joined again by Jon Paulien from Loma Linda University, and we're so grateful to have you here, Jon.
Thank you.
One of the things that I've been thinking about is how many demoniacs were there? If you look through the Synoptic Gospels, that's the first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In Matthew 8, verse 28, it says this: "When he came to the other side, to the country of the Gadarenes, 2 demoniacs coming out of the tombs met him. They were so fierce that no one could pass that way." I think Julian has Luke for us.
Mark 5:2. When Jesus got out the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. So the reference here seems to be to one demoniac.
And then again in Luke 8:27, it says this: "As he stepped out on land, a man of the city who had demons met him. For a long time he had worn no clothes, and he did not live in a house but in the tombs." So it seems that Mark and Luke only have one demoniac, but Matthew have 2. Yet the story is exactly the same. What do you think is going on there?
Well, I suppose I'd ask you, how many demoniacs do you need?
Well, I don't know. It depends on what you need them for.
All right. That's fair enough. Yeah, scholars have always struggled with these, and students of the Bible from every imaginable background. Obviously, one response one could give is the Bible's simply wrong. It just shows how fictional these stories are. They can't even get the numbers straight. Yeah. And I think some people react in that way. At the opposite extreme are people who feel defensive toward the Bible, and they would say every detail of every story must be accurate. So if there's 2 demoniacs here and there's 1 demoniac there, then it must be there were 2 different demoniac stories. And Matthew is telling one of those events, and Mark and Luke are telling another. Now that certainly is a possibility. And there are cases in which the story is told differently enough that one could say, yeah, maybe there were 2 different incidents. Like, for example, you have feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. And, it seems to be very similar events, and yet both events are in the same gospel. So that the detail is explained by the fact that the story happened twice in different contexts. You have a similar issue, for example, Jesus gives a Sermon on the Mount. And then in Luke chapter 6, roughly the same sermon is given on the plain. Did Luke and Matthew differ on a detail? Or did Jesus give that sermon twice? And encouraging that idea is the sermon in Luke has quite a number of differences. So it's conceivable maybe that Jesus gave a similar sermon on 2 different occasions, one on a mountain, one on the, on the plain. So I think the more conservative perspective often is, if you believe that every detail's got to be accurate, then we got to figure out a way for all of these to be right.
Okay.
All right. I think the best biblical scholarship will take a middle approach between those 2. And that approach would be that the Bible is a divine book. It's God-guided, and it is accurate for its purpose, but that the Bible is also a human book. It's written by people whose memory can be faulty, and in details, they often get it wrong. Say, for example, you're walking down the street and there's a car accident, and 2 or 3 cars are banged up together, and there's a couple people laying on the ground, and a few people standing around bleeding and so on. And later on, this comes into court, and they're interviewing everybody that saw the accident, and they all tell a different story. Now, why would that be? Well, psychologically, the reason for that is that human beings have a limited capacity to take in information at any one time. And so we tend to screen out information that either isn't interesting to us or that is threatening in some way. And everybody observing a scene tends to see some things and screen out others. That's pretty natural, pretty consistent. So I think the better way to approach texts like this is to recognize that while God was guiding the writing of the story of Jesus, he was not all that concerned about the details. He was concerned about the key message to the story. And of course, one of the messages that would come across is that Jesus came to this earth for victory over evil and evil powers. And this story then would be almost a parable, if you wish, about how Jesus was not intimidated by these demonic powers. You look back to the temptation in the wilderness, and there he overcame Satan, and now he's continuing to do that as he works his way across. So my sense of the matter, in this case, it was probably one story, although you could make the other case. If it is one story, the difference in detail would be explained by the humanness in the story. Actually, instead of proving the Bible is wrong or distorted, it actually proves the Bible is more accurate, because if you were fabricating a perfect story, you would make sure all the details square up. But it's actually very natural, if a real event happened, it's very natural for people to remember it in different ways. So the way that the Bible presents it with these three different pictures actually is an evidence for its truthfulness, that the events it's describing are actual historical events that really occurred. Now, a similar one that's confusing to people is in Matthew, the temptations of Jesus are described in a certain order. In Luke, the temptations are in a different order. Now, I don't think anybody thinks the temptations happened twice. So how did they get out of order? And I think as scholars, we take a look at the picture, and the impression is that the biblical writers wrote with a purpose. Bible writers described the story as they remembered it, but they didn't necessarily put it in the order that the events actually happened. In fact, Luke, it's pretty evident Luke doesn't know the geography of Palestine. Because he, for example, tells the story of Lazarus and Mary, and then Jesus goes on a long journey, goes over 9 chapters, arrives in Jericho. Now, Lazarus lived 2 miles from Jerusalem. Jericho's 27 miles from Jerusalem. They get to Jericho after a long journey and then get to Jerusalem. Okay. So clearly, Luke seems to be less familiar. He's, as a Gentile from Greece, he may not have been familiar at all with the geography of Palestine. So as he hears the stories, he puts them into a package that for him expresses the message that he wants to give. And as a doctor, it's a healing message.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned a number of interesting things. You mentioned eyewitnesses earlier.
Yeah.
You mentioned Luke hearing the stories. Is there, or rather, what role do sort of eyewitnesses and sources play in relation to the stories that we find in these texts today? Were all the gospel writers present when these events happened? Were they getting them from secondary sources? Or did they sort of have books that were published after Jesus was written? Was there a local newspaper that maybe everybody would open up and it would say, look, Jesus did this today? I'm wondering, what role those sources played, and if maybe that might explain some of the things that we see taking place.
Fabulous question. And in fact, there's one place where a gospel writer actually describes the process, and that's in the book of Luke in chapter 1. Right at the opening of the Gospel of Luke. And I invite those watching to go ahead and pause this if you wish and find the text. It's Luke chapter 1 and verses 1 to 4. And I'll be reading from the English Standard Version. It says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us." So he says, many people have written a narrative. So when Luke is writing, there are a number of Gospels. And he apparently has some of them. "Just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us." So here he gives three sources. People who have written Gospels ahead of him, people who were eyewitnesses, and then people who were ministers of the word. This is not the usual word for pastor or minister. This is the word that was a technical term in the ancient Greco-Roman world for professional memorizers. See, in those days, paper was really expensive. You could write on granite, or you could write on sheepskins, or write on papyrus. It was expensive business to write. But you had people who would memorize things. And particularly in courts, people would memorize law documents and memorize sort of a history of a community, so that when a dispute came up, they could say, well, I think we decided this. You know that in every group there's a historian, right? So, well, I remember 35 years ago we did this, and then everybody says, oh, okay, that's helpful. So you had these kind of people in the ancient world, professional memorizers. Mark was a huperetes in the Greek, a professional memorizer. When he abandoned Paul, Paul was really mad because Mark was his source of the gospel. And so now he's going to do a missionary journey without the gospel story. So that disturbed Paul a great deal. So anyway, Luke reads some books, talks to eyewitnesses, talks to some of these professional memorizers, and then says, verse 3, "It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught." So Luke has these three sources, and he writes what he calls, what did it say here? He wrote an orderly account. It doesn't seem to be geographical order, because we already mentioned that. It doesn't seem to be chronological order, because he has things in different places than Matthew did. But it seems to be a logical order. He has a purpose, he has a mission, and he writes in that order. If you compare that with one other text, and that's John chapter 20 and verse 31. So these are the texts that actually unpack, verse 30, that unpack this issue that you were asking. It says, now, this is John 20, verse 30. "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book." He left out a ton of material. "But these are written," what he wrote, "so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." Each of these gospel writers was writing on the basis of a historical reality. Certain things happened, and they happened even in a certain order. But these gospel writers seem less interested in raw history than they are in telling a story that has a purpose, and that purpose is the impact it would have on the reader. Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell a similar story, but each has a different purpose. And because of that different purpose, they come out differently. But this, if anything, is actually evidence for the historicity of the original events.
So really the differences we have aren't a problem, but they're kind of evidence that things are working well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's right. I think, and again, that might not be obvious from these 10, 15 minutes, but as scholars look at these things, the very discrepancies in minor things is what you would expect if it's actually historically accurate.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us today on Biblios, the place where we think about biblical thinking. We hope to see you again next time.